The large county courthouse buzzed with activity on a humid Monday morning. People rushed through security checks, lawyers hurried with coffee cups in hand, and court officers directed confused visitors. Among them was Terrell Washington, a 28-year-old construction worker who stood out in his carefully ironed shirt and tie. His hands shook slightly as he checked the court schedule posted on the wall. Courtroom 4B, Judge William Harrison, he whispered to himself, trying to remember the route his public defender had hastily explained last week. Terrell had never been in serious trouble before. The charge was a minor traffic violation that had escalated due to a misunderstanding and a missing document. His public defender, an overworked young woman with 3 other cases that morning, had barely spent 15 minutes reviewing his situation. "Just agree to the fine, and we'll get you out of there quickly," she had advised, rushing to her next appointment. When Terrell entered courtroom 4B, the atmosphere immediately felt heavy. Judge William Harrison, a 62-year-old man with salt and pepper hair and reading glasses perched on his nose, sat elevated behind the bench. His reputation preceded him, strict, by the book, and according to courthouse whispers, particularly harsh on certain defendants. In the back row sat Marcus Johnson, a 35-year-old attorney who had stopped by to file some paperwork for another case. He hadn't planned to stay, but something about the nervous man entering the courtroom caught his attention. Marcus decided to observe for a few minutes. "Case number 47,293, Washington v. State," announced the clerk. Terrell approached the front with his public defender, who was still flipping through his file papers. "Mr. Washington," Judge Harrison began, not looking up from his papers, "I see this isn't your first time violating Section 342. Your Honor, if I could explain," Terrell started. "Did I ask you to speak?" Harrison cut him off, finally looking up with raised eyebrows. A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. The public defender quickly jumped in. "Your Honor, my client wishes to plead." "Is your client unable to follow simple instructions?" Harrison interrupted again. "I didn't ask him to speak." A small, mocking smile played on his lips. From the back, Marcus straightened up, his attention now fully captured by the scene unfolding. "Now, Mr. Washington," Harrison continued, pronouncing the name with unusual emphasis, "your record shows a pattern of disregard for traffic regulations. What makes you think the laws apply differently to you?" Terrell stood straight, respectful despite the judge's tone. "Sir, I understand the laws." There was a confusion about. Judge Harrison let out a short, sharp laugh that echoed in the quiet courtroom. "Confusion? The law isn't confusing, Mr. Washington. Red means stop. Documents need to be current. These are simple concepts." He turned to look at the courtroom audience. "Wouldn't you all agree?" No one responded. The public defender looked down at her papers, clearly uncomfortable but not intervening. Marcus watched as Terrell's shoulders tensed. The construction worker remained composed, though his hands gripped the table edge tightly. "Your Honor," the public defender finally said, "we're prepared to pay the fine and—" "Double the standard amount seems appropriate given the circumstances," Harrison declared, cutting her off again. "And mandatory traffic safety classes." "But Your Honor," Terrell spoke up, his voice steady despite everything, "I have documentation that shows." "Are you arguing with me now?" Harrison's voice grew sharper, his face reddening slightly. "Perhaps you need time to reflect on respect for this court. One night in county holding might." Marcus had seen enough. He quietly stood, gathered his briefcase, and moved toward the front of the courtroom. The movement caught Judge Harrison's eye. "Do you have business before this court, Counselor?" Harrison asked impatiently. "I believe I do now, Your Honor," Marcus replied calmly, approaching the defense table. "May I have a moment with Mr. Washington?" Judge Harrison's eyes narrowed as he looked at Marcus Johnson. The unexpected interruption clearly annoyed him. "And you are?" the judge asked, his tone sharp. "Marcus Johnson, Your Honor. I'm an attorney with Johnson and Associates," Marcus replied calmly. His firm was small but respected in legal circles for taking on difficult cases. The judge glanced at his watch with an exaggerated motion. "We don't have time for this, Counselor. Court is in session." "I understand, Your Honor. 5 minutes is all I request," Marcus said, his voice respectful but firm. Something in Marcus's confident stance made the judge pause. After a moment of tense silence, Harrison waved his hand dismissively. 5 minutes. Not a second more. Marcus nodded to Terrell, and they moved to a corner of the courtroom. The young public defender looked relieved and quickly stepped aside. "I've been watching what's happening here," Marcus said quietly. "Something doesn't seem right about how your case is being handled." Terrell looked surprised that a stranger would care. "I have proof that my registration was valid. The officer made a mistake, but the judge won't even look at my papers." "Do you have those documents with you?" Marcus asked. Terrell nodded and pulled out a folder from his bag. Marcus quickly reviewed the papers, his experienced eye spotting the issue immediately. "This is clearly a mistake in the system," Marcus whispered. "Your registration was valid. The court's database is showing the wrong information." Meanwhile, Judge Harrison tapped his gavel impatiently. "Time's up, gentlemen." Marcus turned back toward the bench. He made a quick decision that would change everything. "Your Honor, I'll be representing Mr. Washington from this point forward." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The public defender looked relieved as she gathered her things. "Sudden interest in traffic violations, Mr. Johnson?" Judge Harrison asked with a mocking smile. "I thought your firm handled more significant cases." "Every case is significant when justice is at stake, Your Honor," Marcus replied evenly. The judge's smile faded. "Very well. Does your client still wish to waste this court's time arguing, or will he accept the ruling and pay the fine?" Marcus stepped forward. "We request a brief continuance to properly present evidence that has not been considered." "Evidence?" Judge Harrison laughed again. "It's a simple traffic violation." "With respect, Your Honor, simple matters still deserve proper process," Marcus said. The judge leaned forward, his patience visibly wearing thin. "Motion denied. Will your client pay the fine, or shall we escalate this further?" Marcus felt Terrell tense beside him. He understood why. For a construction worker, the double fine would mean a significant financial hardship. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice steady, "before we proceed, I'd like to enter Mr. Washington's registration documents into evidence." "I've already ruled on this matter, Counselor," Harrison said coldly. "Then I must respectfully request this conversation be included in the court record," Marcus replied. A flash of concern crossed Judge Harrison's face. He knew that refusing to allow evidence into the record could be problematic if the case were appealed. After a tense moment, the judge nodded to the court reporter. "Fine. Submit your evidence." As Marcus handed the documents to the clerk, he noticed a man in a suit sitting in the front row watching with interest. The man looked familiar. Marcus realized he was a senior partner from one of the city's largest law firms. While the judge reviewed the papers with obvious reluctance, Terrell leaned toward Marcus. "Why are you helping me?" he whispered. "You don't even know me." Marcus smiled slightly. "Because what's happening here isn't right, and sometimes people need someone in their corner who knows how to fight." Judge Harrison looked up from the papers, his expression unreadable. "Court will recess for 30 minutes while I review these documents." He struck his gavel with more force than necessary. As people began to file out of the courtroom, the well-dressed man from the front row approached Marcus. "Interesting move in there, Johnson," he said quietly. "You know Harrison doesn't forget people who challenge him." Marcus nodded. Some things are worth the risk. The courthouse cafeteria buzzed with quiet conversations as Marcus and Terrell sat at a corner table. The 30-minute recess gave them precious little time to plan their next move. "Tell me everything about what happened when you were pulled over," Marcus said, pulling out a small notebook. Terrell explained how the officer had claimed his registration was expired, even though he had renewed it 3 weeks earlier. The officer wouldn't even look at his paperwork. "And then he wrote me a ticket anyway," Terrell finished, "said I was being difficult." Marcus nodded, taking notes. "And your public defender?" "Met her for maybe 10 minutes before court. She just kept saying to pay the fine and be done with it." Terrell's shoulders slumped. "I'm already behind on rent this month. That double fine would mean my kids don't get new school shoes." Marcus tapped his pen thoughtfully. "There's something else going on here." Judge Harrison's reaction was extreme for a simple traffic case. The well-dressed man who had approached them earlier passed by their table, nodding slightly at Marcus before exiting the cafeteria. "Who was that?" Terrell asked. Robert Chen. He's a partner at Greenfield and Chen. We've crossed paths before, Marcus explained. But never mind him. We need to focus on your case. Marcus pulled out his phone and quickly searched through the county court records database. His eyebrows rose as he scrolled through case after case. This is interesting, he said quietly. In the past 6 months, Judge Harrison has handled 64 traffic violation cases. In cases with white defendants, he dismissed 78% or reduced the fines. But for black and Hispanic defendants, Marcus looked up, his expression serious. The dismissal rate is only 12%. Terrell's eyes widened. That can't be legal. It's not about what's technically legal. It's about patterns that reveal biases, Marcus explained. And there's more. He showed Terrell his phone screen, pointing to a news article from 3 weeks ago. The county is investigating discrepancies in the traffic registration database. There have been numerous errors reported, especially for renewals processed at the Southside DMV office. That's where I renewed mine, Terrell said, sitting up straighter. Marcus nodded. I suspected as much. The system is showing your registration has expired when it's actually valid. And Judge Harrison is refusing to look at your physical documentation that proves it. He scrolled to another page on his phone. There's also a recent state Supreme Court ruling, Peterson v. State, that directly addresses this issue. The court ruled that physical registration documentation supersedes database information when there's a conflict. Terrell looked confused. If there's a ruling like that, why would the judge still try to find me? Marcus closed his notebook. That's the question, isn't it? Either he doesn't know about the ruling, which is unlikely, or what? Or he's deliberately ignoring it, Marcus finished. And that would be judicial misconduct. A court officer appeared at the cafeteria entrance. All parties in Washington versus State, court resumes in 5 minutes. As they stood to leave, Terrell hesitated. Why are you doing this, Mr. Johnson? You could be handling big cases with important clients. Instead, you're helping me with a traffic ticket. Marcus gathered his papers. My father was a bus driver. When I was 10, he got a ticket for a broken taillight that wasn't actually broken. The judge wouldn't listen, and the fine took our grocery money for 2 weeks. He looked Terrell in the eye. Everyone deserves fair treatment under the law. That's why I became a lawyer. As they walked back toward the courtroom, Marcus spotted Robert Chen again, now talking on his phone near the water fountain. When Chen saw them, he ended his call and approached. Johnson, a word? Chen asked. Marcus glanced at Terrell. Go ahead, I'll be right there. Once Terrell was out of earshot, Chen spoke quietly. You should know that Harrison and District Attorney Phillips play golf together every Sunday. If you're planning what I think you are, be careful. Harrison has powerful friends. So do I, Marcus replied. Chen smiled slightly. Perhaps you do. Good luck in there. Marcus rejoined Terrell at the courtroom doors, his mind already planning their strategy. As they entered, he noticed Judge Harrison watching them with cold eyes. The battle was just beginning. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harrison took his seat. His face showed no emotion, but his fingers drummed on the bench, a sign of irritation that Marcus had learned to recognize from other judges. The court clerk called the case again, and Marcus stood confidently beside Terrell. Well, Mr. Johnson, Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying a hint of sarcasm. I've reviewed the documentation you submitted. While interesting, it doesn't change my ruling. Marcus remained composed. Your Honor, with all due respect, the documentation clearly shows Mr. Washington's registration was valid at the time of the citation. The judge leaned forward. The police officer's report indicates otherwise, Counselor. Are you suggesting our law enforcement officers are filing false reports? A trap. Marcus recognized it immediately. He needed to be careful with his words. Not at all, Your Honor. I'm suggesting there was a database error, which is why the physical documentation is so important in this case. Judge Harrison waved his hand dismissively. The fine stands, Mr. Johnson. Double the amount, as previously stated, unless you'd like to continue wasting this court's time. Several attorneys in the gallery exchanged glances. Everyone could sense the unusual tension for what should have been a routine traffic case. Your Honor, Marcus said, pulling out a folder from his briefcase, I'd like to enter into evidence the recent state Supreme Court ruling in Peterson v. State, which establishes that physical documentation supersedes electronic records in cases of discrepancy. The judge's expression darkened. I'm familiar with that ruling, Counselor. I don't need a first-year law lesson from you. Of course not, Your Honor, Marcus replied respectfully. I simply want to ensure the court record reflects all relevant precedents. A murmur passed through the courtroom. Judge Harrison struck his gavel once, silencing the crowd. Mr. Johnson, how long have you been practicing law? Harrison asked, his tone now openly condescending. 7 years, Your Honor. 7 years, Harrison repeated with a small laugh. I've been on this bench for 23 years. Perhaps you should trust that I know how to interpret legal precedent better than you do. Marcus noticed the district attorney, a woman named Sarah Phillips, entering the courtroom and quietly taking a seat in the front row. The judge's golfing partner, according to Chen. This was getting interesting. I have nothing but respect for your experience, Your Honor, Marcus said. However, I must advocate for my client according to the law. Judge Harrison's face reddened slightly. The law is what I say it is in my courtroom, Counselor. A dangerous statement. Marcus saw Phillips wince slightly from her seat. For the record, Marcus continued calmly, may I ask on what grounds the court is rejecting the Peterson precedent in this case? The courtroom was utterly silent now. Everyone present knew Marcus had just backed the judge into a corner. Either Harrison had to explain why he was ignoring clear legal precedent, or he had to change his ruling. Your Honor, District Attorney Phillips suddenly stood. The state would like to request a brief recess to review the documentation. Judge Harrison looked at Phillips with surprise, clearly not expecting her intervention. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, he nodded. Court will recess for 15 minutes, he announced, striking his gavel again before quickly leaving the bench. As people began to move around, Terrell turned to Marcus with wide eyes. What just happened? He whispered. The district attorney just threw the judge a lifeline, Marcus explained quietly. She's going to try to find a way for him to save face. Robert Chen approached them from the gallery, an impressed expression on his face. Clean move, Johnson, he said. Forcing him to state his reasoning on record was smart. It's not over yet, Marcus replied. Harrison won't back down easily. The courtroom deputy told me Harrison went straight to his chambers and slammed the door, Chen added. Phillips followed him. Marcus nodded, thinking rapidly. They'll come back with something. We need to be ready. As they talked, Marcus noticed several people in the courtroom watching them with interest. Word was spreading about the showdown between the young attorney and the powerful judge. What do we do now? Terrell asked, nervousness clear in his voice. Now, Marcus said, we wait for them to make their next move. The 15-minute recess stretched to 25 minutes before Judge Harrison returned to the courtroom. His face was composed now, but the tightness around his mouth betrayed his tension. District Attorney Phillips followed shortly after, taking her position at the prosecution table with a thick law book in hand. Court is back in session, Judge Harrison announced, his voice deliberately measured. In the matter of Washington v. State, I've had further opportunity to review the evidence. Marcus stood attentively, noting how the judge avoided looking directly at him. Before we continue, Harrison said, District Attorney Phillips has something to add to the record. Phillips rose smoothly. Your Honor, after reviewing the documentation provided by the defense, the state acknowledges there may have been a database discrepancy regarding Mr. Washington's registration status. A tactical retreat, Marcus realized. They were opening a path for the judge to back down without losing face completely. However, Phillips continued, we maintain that the officer acted in good faith based on the information available to him at the time. Marcus saw the strategy forming. They would concede the registration issue, but try to justify the fine on other grounds. Thank you, Ms. Phillips, the judge said. Mr. Johnson, do you have a response? Marcus stepped forward. Yes, Your Honor. While I appreciate the state's acknowledgement of the database error, this underscores my earlier point about the Peterson precedent. Additionally, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Section 342.7 of the Traffic Code. He pulled out a printed copy of the statute and handed it to the court clerk. This section clearly states that an officer must examine physical documentation when presented. Mr. Washington attempted to show his valid registration, but the officer refused. Judge Harrison frowned as he looked at the statute. This wasn't part of the retreat path Phillips had created for him. Furthermore, Marcus continued, his voice calm but firm, I prepared a brief analysis of similar cases in this court over the past 6 months. Marcus handed another document to the clerk. The judge's eyes widened slightly as he realized what Marcus was doing. Your Honor, you may find it concerning, as I did, to note the significant statistical disparity in outcomes based on the defendant's race in these cases. The courtroom went completely still. Marcus hadn't directly accused the judge of bias, but the implication hung in the air. He was offering Harrison a choice: dismiss Terrell's case or risk having these statistics become part of public record. Phillips stood quickly. Objection, Your Honor. This statistical analysis is irrelevant to the specific case before us. Is it irrelevant? Marcus asked, turning slightly to address both the judge and the now packed gallery. Equal protection under the law is fundamental to our judicial system. Patterns that suggest otherwise merit examination. Judge Harrison's knuckles turned white as he gripped his gavel. Mr. Johnson, you're treading on dangerous ground. I'm simply advocating for my client, Your Honor, Marcus replied, and ensuring all relevant information is entered into the record. The unspoken message was clear. This record could be reviewed by judicial oversight committees. Harrison was silent for a long moment, clearly calculating his options. The courtroom remained tense, with spectators barely breathing. In light of the information presented, the judge finally said, each word seemingly painful, this court finds that there is sufficient doubt regarding the validity of the citation. He looked directly at Marcus for the first time since returning to the bench. Case dismissed. Terrell exhaled sharply beside Marcus. Around them, the gallery buzzed with whispers. Thank you, Your Honor, Marcus said simply. As they gathered their papers, Marcus noticed Robert Chen nodding approvingly from the gallery. Several other attorneys were watching with newfound respect. Is it really over? Terrell whispered as they turned to leave. The case is, Marcus replied quietly, but I suspect this was just the beginning of something larger. Judge Harrison's voice stopped them at the door. Mr. Johnson. Marcus turned back. Yes, Your Honor. The judge's expression was unreadable. I'll be watching your career with interest. It wasn't a compliment, but it wasn't quite a threat either. It was recognition. Marcus nodded respectfully before following Terrell out of the courtroom. The courthouse hallway buzzed with whispers as Marcus and Terrell exited courtroom 4B. Several people nodded respectfully at Marcus, while others simply stared. Word of what had happened was already spreading through the building. Did we really win? Terrell asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Just like that? Marcus smiled slightly. We did. The case is dismissed. No fine, no traffic school, nothing on your record. Man, I don't even know how to thank you. Terrell's eyes shone with emotion. You stepped in for a complete stranger and stood up to that judge. Before Marcus could respond, District Attorney Phillips approached them, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. Mr. Johnson, she said, her voice professional but tight. A word? Marcus nodded to Terrell. Give me a minute. They stepped aside to a quiet corner of the hallway. Phillips maintained her composed expression, but her eyes revealed her frustration. That was quite a performance in there, she said quietly. Bringing up those statistics was a bold move. It wasn't a performance, Ms. Phillips. It was advocacy, Marcus replied. Phillips glanced around to ensure no one could hear them. You made an enemy today. Judge Harrison doesn't forget when someone challenges him publicly. Is that a warning or a threat? Marcus asked calmly. Take it how you want. She paused, studying him. You know, you could have handled this differently. A quiet word in chambers, perhaps. Instead, you chose to embarrass him in open court. Marcus shook his head. This wasn't about embarrassing anyone. It was about justice. How many others has he treated the way he treated Mr. Washington? People who didn't have someone to speak up for them. Phillips's expression softened slightly. Not everyone sees the world in black and white, Johnson. Some things are black and white, Marcus replied. Equal treatment under the law is one of them. Before Phillips could respond, Robert Chen joined them, his expensive suit standing out even among the well-dressed courthouse crowd. "Miss Phillips," Chen nodded politely. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, we were just finishing," Phillips said. She gave Marcus one last meaningful look before walking away. Chen watched her leave. "Interesting day in court." "You could say that," Marcus agreed. "You know," Chen said casually, "my firm has been looking for someone with your approach to the law. Someone who isn't afraid to challenge the system when necessary." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering me a job, Mr. Chen?" "Let's call it a conversation about possibilities." Chen smiled. "Here's my card. Call my office next week if you're interested." As Chen walked away, Terrell rejoined Marcus. "What was that about?" "Job offer, I think," Marcus said, tucking the card into his pocket. They made their way down the courthouse steps into the bright afternoon sunlight. As they reached the bottom, Marcus noticed a young woman taking notes while talking to another person who had been in the courtroom. "Is that a reporter?" Terrell asked. "Looks like it," Marcus replied. "News travels fast." Terrell shook his head in amazement. All this from a simple traffic ticket. "It was never just about a traffic ticket," Marcus said. "It was about dignity and fair treatment. Something everyone deserves but not everyone receives." As they prepared to part ways, Terrell extended his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson, not just for helping me, but for showing me that the system can work, even when it seems stacked against us." Marcus shook his hand firmly. "The system only works when good people hold it accountable, Mr. Washington." As Terrell walked away, Marcus's phone buzzed with a notification. It was a court alert. His next 3 cases had been reassigned to different judges. None of them would be heard by Judge Harrison. The message was clear. Battle in court might be over, but the war had just begun. 1 week after the confrontation in courtroom 4B, Marcus sat in his small office reviewing files. The desk phone rang, interrupting his concentration. "Johnson and Associates," he answered. "Mr. Johnson, this is Clerk Williams from Judge Ramirez's office. Your motion hearing for State v. Dawson has been moved up to tomorrow at 9 a.m. Marcus frowned. "That's unusual. May I ask why?" "Judge Ramirez specifically requested it," the clerk replied, offering no further explanation. After hanging up, Marcus leaned back in his chair. Judge Elena Ramirez was known for her fairness and strict adherence to procedure. Having his case moved to her courtroom was interesting timing. His office door opened, and his assistant Lisa poked her head in. "There's someone here to see you. Says he doesn't have an appointment but thinks you'll want to talk to him." "Who is it?" "A court reporter named James Wilson." Marcus's curiosity piqued. "Send him in." James Wilson was a thin man with sharp eyes that noticed everything. He'd been the court reporter in Judge Harrison's courtroom during Terrell's case. "Mr. Wilson, what can I do for you?" Marcus asked, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Wilson sat down carefully. "What I'm about to tell you could cost me my job, Mr. Johnson." "I understand. Anything you share will remain confidential." Wilson nodded, then spoke quietly. "After you left last week, Judge Harrison was furious. I've never seen him so angry in my 15 years at the courthouse." "I'm not surprised," Marcus replied. "There's more," Wilson continued. "Yesterday, I was setting up recording equipment in the judge's conference room for a meeting. They didn't realize I was in the equipment closet when they started talking." Marcus leaned forward. "Go on." "Judge Harrison was complaining about you to the other judges. He wanted them to make things difficult for you in their courtrooms." Wilson paused. "But Judge Ramirez stood up to him." "She did?" Wilson nodded. "She said, and I quote, 'If Johnson found a pattern in your rulings, Harrison, that's on you, not him. I won't punish an attorney for doing his job.' Then she requested that your cases be transferred to her docket." Marcus sat back, processing this information. "Why are you telling me this?" Wilson's expression turned serious. "Because what happened in that courtroom last week matters. I've watched Judge Harrison bully defendants for years, especially young black men. Nobody ever challenged him until you did." A knock at the door interrupted them. Lisa entered with a newspaper. "You might want to see this," she said, placing it on Marcus's desk. The headline read, "Local Attorney Challenges Judicial Bias, Statistical analysis raises questions about equal justice. The article didn't name Judge Harrison directly, but it detailed the pattern of rulings that Marcus had presented in court. It's already having an effect, Wilson said, nodding at the paper. This morning, Harrison was polite to everyone in his courtroom, even asked a young black defendant about his job before ruling. Small steps, Marcus murmured. Sometimes that's how change happens, Wilson replied, standing to leave. I should go. I just wanted you to know what's happening. After Wilson left, Marcus picked up his phone and dialed Terrell's number. Mr. Washington, it's Marcus Johnson. How are you doing? Mr. Johnson, I'm good. Actually, I'm great, Terrell said enthusiastically. I got that promotion at work I was telling you about. Congratulations. That's wonderful news. I couldn't have done it if I'd had that fine to pay or a mark on my record. I owe you. You don't owe me anything, Marcus assured him. I'm just glad things worked out. After they hung up, Marcus looked at Robert Chen's business card on his desk, then at the newspaper headline. His phone was already ringing with new clients who had read the article. Sometimes, standing up for what was right came with unexpected consequences, both challenging and rewarding. The judicial system wasn't perfect, but today, in one small corner of it, the scales of justice had found their balance again. 3 months after the confrontation with Judge Harrison, Marcus Johnson's law practice had transformed. His small office now buzzed with activity as 2 new junior attorneys and an additional paralegal worked on a growing caseload. The morning sun streamed through the windows as Marcus reviewed a motion at his desk. Lisa knocked and entered with a stack of mail. More letters from people asking for help, she said, placing them on his desk. And this one's marked personal. Marcus opened the personal letter first. Inside was a handwritten note from Terrell Washington, along with a photograph of him with 2 smiling children. Thought you might like to see who really benefited from your help that day, the note read. My kids, Marcus and Lisa, named after the 2 people who stood up for their dad. The promotion is working out great. Thank you for everything. Marcus smiled, placing the photo on his desk next to his computer. The phone rang, and Lisa answered it in the outer office. Mr. Johnson, it's Judge Ramirez on line 1, she called. Good morning, Judge Ramirez, Marcus answered. Johnson, I wanted to give you a heads up, Ramirez said without preamble. The Judicial Review Committee is meeting today about Judge Harrison, where statistical analysis caused quite a stir when it circulated among the judiciary. I never submitted it formally to any committee, Marcus noted. No, but I did, Ramirez replied. With some additional data my clerk compiled, Harrison's patterns couldn't be ignored any longer. After hanging up, Marcus sat thoughtfully. His confrontation with Harrison had never been about personal vendetta. It was about ensuring equal justice. His office door opened again, and Robert Chen walked in. Marcus had turned down the job offer from Chen's prestigious firm, preferring to build his own practice focused on helping clients who often couldn't afford high-priced legal representation. Working hard as usual, I see, Chen commented, glancing around the busy office. What brings you here, Robert? Marcus asked. Chen sat down. The Bar Association is forming a new committee on judicial fairness in our district. They want you on it. Me? I'm hardly the most popular attorney with the judges right now. That's exactly why they want you, Chen explained. Your willingness to challenge bias has earned respect, even from those who wouldn't admit it publicly. As they discussed the details, District Attorney Phillips appeared in the doorway. Both men looked up in surprise. Sorry to interrupt, she said. Your assistant said I could come in. Miss Phillips, Marcus greeted her. What can I do for you? She placed a file on his desk. The database errors we found in Mr. Washington's case weren't isolated incidents. My office discovered systematic problems affecting hundreds of cases, mostly from lower-income neighborhoods. I'm not surprised, Marcus said. We're reviewing all affected cases, Phillips continued. But I wanted to personally tell you that your stand that day set important changes in motion. After Phillips left, Chen raised an eyebrow. Seems you've made quite an impact. It wasn't just me, Marcus replied. Terrell had the courage to stand up for himself first. I just helped give him a voice. Late that afternoon, as Marcus was preparing to leave, Lisa brought in the evening newspaper. The headline read, Judge Harrison announces early retirement amid review of court practices. Marcus read the article carefully. Harrison's statement mentioned personal reasons for his retirement, but the timing told the real story. As Marcus packed his briefcase, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Thank you for showing me I wasn't alone. Your example gave me courage." It was signed simply, Court Reporter Wilson. Marcus smiled as he turned off his office light. One case, one stand for justice, had created ripples that continued to spread. The system wasn't perfect. It never would be. But as long as people were willing to stand up for what was right, there was hope for change. And sometimes, that was enough.